How could you bet me in poker? To him, of all people. My voice was shaking with anger, but beneath it, fear crept in like an unwelcome guest. Harry, my stepfather, didn't flinch. He sat across from me in his favorite armchair, swirling a glass of whiskey in his hand, as if this was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. "Calm down, Savannah," he said, his tone infuriatingly casual. "You're overreacting," voice rising. "You bet me, Harry. Like I'm some kind of prize. And you didn't just bet me to anyone, you gave me to Caleb Ford. Do you even understand what you've done?" Harry finally looked up, his expression devoid of any guilt. If anything, he looked bored. "Yes, I understand perfectly. Caleb's the best thing that could happen to you." The best thing? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My hands clenched into fists, nails digging into my palms. "Do you even know who he is?" People don't just talk about Caleb Ford, they whisper about him like he's a myth. "The man can ruin lives with a single phone call, Harry. And you handed me to him like it's no big deal." Harry shrugged, taking a long sip of his drink before setting the glass down. "That's exactly why you should calm down. Caleb Ford isn't some thug or scam artist. He's one of the most powerful men in the city. Hell, in the entire state. Do you think those skyscrapers downtown built themselves? Caleb owns most of them. The rest? They pay him rent." His words didn't reassure me, they terrified me. Caleb Ford was a name I'd grown up hearing in hushed conversations. He wasn't just rich, he was untouchable. People who crossed him didn't just lose, they disappeared. "And you think that makes this better?" I hissed, my voice trembling with suppressed rage. "That's supposed to make me feel safe? You handed me over to a man who probably doesn't even remember the last time he heard the word no." Harry leaned forward slightly, his expression finally sharpening. "Listen to me, Savannah. I didn't do this to hurt you. I owed Caleb a debt. A big one. He gave me a chance to settle it, and this was the deal. You'll be fine. Caleb always honors his agreements." "Agreements?" I repeated, almost laughing at the absurdity. "You're talking about me like I'm a contract." "I'm not a property, Harry. I'm a person." "You're acting like he's going to hurt you," Harry said, leaning back in his chair. "But Caleb doesn't operate like that. He's a businessman, not a monster." I wanted to scream at him, to shake some sense into him, but the way he sat there, so smug and self-assured, made it clear he wasn't going to listen. To him, this wasn't a betrayal, it was a transaction. "I trusted you," I said, my voice breaking. "I thought you were supposed to look out for me." "And I did," Harry replied. "Trust me, Savannah. Caleb will treat you better than you think." His words were a slap in the face. My legs felt weak, my mind spinning as I tried to process what was happening. This wasn't just about Caleb Ford, it was about the man sitting in front of me, the man who was supposed to protect me, selling me out like I was nothing. And then, as if the situation couldn't get any worse, the doorbell rang. Harry stood up, straightening his shirt as if he was about to greet an old friend. "That'll be him now," he said calmly, like this was all part of the plan. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest as he walked to the door and opened it. And there he was. Caleb Ford. He stepped into the house like he owned it, which, for all intents and purposes, he probably did. His tailored suit clung to his tall frame, his presence radiating power. Dark, calculating eyes scanned the room before they landed on me. He smiled, a small, controlled smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Ah, Savannah," he said, his voice deep and smooth. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you." I didn't move. I didn't speak. I felt like a rabbit caught in the gaze of a predator. "She's a little overwhelmed," Harry said, laughing nervously. "But she'll warm up to you." Caleb didn't reply to Harry. His eyes stayed on me, his smile widening just slightly. I don't doubt it. The air felt heavy, suffocating. I wanted to run, to scream, but my feet felt glued to the floor. "Well, I'll leave you two to talk," Harry said, patting Caleb on the shoulder before disappearing into another room. Caleb took a step closer, his movements slow and deliberate. "I imagine this is a lot to take in," he said, his tone almost gentle. "But I want you to know, I'm not the monster you think I am." "Then what are you?" I managed to ask, my voice barely a whisper. He smiled again, this time with something resembling amusement. "I'm the man who gets what he wants, Savannah." And right now, that's you. My stomach churned, but there was something else too, something I hated myself for feeling. Caleb wasn't just intimidating. He was magnetic. His presence was overwhelming, yes, but it also drew me in, leaving me questioning everything I thought I knew. This was only the beginning, and deep down, I knew it was going to get much worse. Or maybe, much more complicated. Caleb arrived that same evening. He didn't knock like a guest, nor did he wait for an invitation to step inside. When Harry opened the door, Caleb strode in with an air of authority that filled the entire house. I stood frozen in the corner of the living room, desperately trying to blend into the shadows. But it didn't matter. The moment Caleb entered, his eyes locked onto mine. "Savannah," he said, his voice deep and deliberate, each syllable perfectly measured. "It's good to finally meet you." I couldn't respond. My throat felt dry, and my thoughts were racing too fast to form words. Caleb was intimidating, yes, but it wasn't just fear that made my pulse quicken. There was something magnetic about him, a power that seemed to draw me in even as it terrified me. "Say hello," Harry said, nudging me slightly. His tone was casual, almost amused, as if this was some kind of family gathering. "Hello," I mumbled, my voice barely audible. Caleb's lips curved into a small smile, not warm, but calculated, as if he knew the effect he had on me. "I was beginning to think you didn't want to meet me." "I didn't," I blurted out before I could stop myself. Harry chuckled nervously, but Caleb didn't seem offended. Instead, his smile widened just a fraction, his eyes never leaving mine. "Honesty," he said, his tone approving. "I like that." Dinner was tense, at least for me. Harry and Caleb chatted easily, discussing business deals and old stories like two old friends. I kept my head down, focusing on my plate, but I could feel Caleb's gaze on me. Every now and then, I'd glance up and catch him watching me, his dark eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. "Are you settling in, Savannah?" he asked suddenly, breaking the flow of the conversation. I hesitated, unsure of what he meant. "Settling in?" "To the idea," he clarified, leaning back in his chair. "Of me. Of us." I froze. "There is no us," I said quickly, my voice sharper than I intended. Harry laughed, but there was an edge to his tone. "She's still warming up to the idea." Caleb didn't laugh. He just smiled, that same unsettling smile, his eyes never leaving mine. "She'll come around," he said, as if I weren't sitting right there. The rest of dinner passed in a blur. I barely tasted the food, my mind too preoccupied with the weight of Caleb's presence and the growing tension in the room. After dinner, Caleb stood to leave. For a moment, I thought the night was finally over, that I could retreat to the safety of my room and pretend this hadn't happened. But before he walked out the door, he turned to me. "Walk me out," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. I hesitated, glancing at Harry, who gave me an encouraging nod. Reluctantly, I followed Caleb to the door. When we reached the front step, he turned to face me, stepping closer than necessary. I could feel the heat radiating off him, his presence overwhelming. "Do you know why Harry made this arrangement?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. "Because he's a coward," I said without thinking. Caleb chuckled softly, shaking his head. "No, Savannah. Because he knows I can give you something he never could." "Like what?" I asked, my voice laced with defiance. "Stability," he said, his eyes boring into mine. "Power. Protection. Things you don't even realize you need yet." I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but his words lingered in the air, sinking into me like a slow poison. "This is just the beginning," he continued, his voice softening. "You'll see." He reached out and brushed a strand of hair from my face, his touch lingering for just a moment too long. My breath hitched, and I hated myself for the way my body responded. "Good night, Savannah," he said, his lips curling into that maddening smile. I watched as he walked away, his figure disappearing into the night. My heart was pounding, my thoughts a chaotic mess. Back inside, Harry was waiting for me in the kitchen. "See," he said, pouring himself another drink. "He's not so bad." "Not so bad?" I repeated, my voice shaking. "He's manipulative, arrogant, and terrifying." "And he's also right," Harry said, fixing me with a look I didn't recognize. "Caleb can give you a life you've only dreamed of, Savannah. You just need to let him." "I don't want his life," I snapped. Harry sighed, leaning back against the counter. You don't know what you want yet. But you will. His words left me reeling. I stormed out of the kitchen, slamming my bedroom door behind me. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the memory of Caleb's eyes, his touch, his voice. And deep down, I hated myself for wondering what would happen the next time I saw him. The days that followed were suffocating. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't get Caleb out of my head. His piercing gaze, his calm yet commanding voice, it all haunted me. What terrified me the most wasn't his presence, but the way he made me feel. I hated it. And yet, I couldn't stop thinking about him. Then, the messages began. At first, they were short and polite. How are you? Or I'm here if you need anything. But as the days went by, they became more personal, more deliberate. One evening, my phone buzzed with a message that made my heart stop. I know you're scared of me, Caleb wrote. But I think you feel the same way I do. I stared at the screen, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. Part of me wanted to reply with anger, to tell him he was wrong. But the other part, the part one hated, knew he wasn't entirely wrong. I didn't respond, but he didn't stop. Every day, his presence grew stronger, not physically, but in the way his words lingered in my mind. When Caleb showed up at the house again, Harry conveniently disappeared into his office, leaving us alone in the living room. The silence between us was deafening. I sat stiffly on the couch, my hands clenched in my lap, while Caleb leaned back in the armchair, completely at ease. You've been ignoring my messages, he said finally, breaking the tension. I didn't think they needed a response, I replied, keeping my eyes fixed on the coffee table. He chuckled softly. Avoidance isn't an answer, Savannah. Maybe I don't have an answer, I said, my voice firmer than I expected. Caleb leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. The movement was subtle, but it closed the distance between us, making the air feel heavier. Or maybe you're afraid of what your answer would be, he said, his voice low and deliberate. My head snapped up, and for the first time, I met his eyes. They weren't just piercing, they were searching, as if he could see straight into my soul. I'm not afraid of you, I said, though the tremor in my voice betrayed me. He smirked, leaning back again. That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean? I asked, the frustration boiling over. Caleb tilted his head slightly, studying me. You're not afraid of me, Savannah. You're afraid of what I make you feel. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to deny it, to tell him he was wrong, but I couldn't. Because deep down, I knew he was right. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Caleb didn't push any further, but his presence was enough to leave me rattled. When he finally left, I went straight to my room, shutting the door behind me and sinking onto the bed. I hated the effect he had on me. The way my heart raced when he was near, the way his words lingered in my mind long after he was gone. And yet, a part of me craved it. The next day, another message appeared on my phone. You're stronger than you think. Stop fighting it. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. Because I already knew there was no point in fighting anymore. One afternoon, Caleb called. His voice on the other end of the line was calm, measured, and yet it carried an edge of command that made my heart race. I want you to see my place, he said. It wasn't a question. When I hesitated, Harry chimed in from across the room, giving me a look that said there was no room for debate. You should go, Savannah. It's a good idea. And just like that, I found myself standing in front of Caleb's penthouse later that evening. The elevator doors opened directly into his apartment, and I stepped into a space that was nothing short of breathtaking. Marble floors gleamed under the soft glow of recessed lighting. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls framed a panoramic view of the city, with the skyline stretching out endlessly under the evening sky. The space was a perfect reflection of Caleb himself, imposing, elegant, and meticulously controlled. Welcome, he said, his voice pulling me from my thoughts. He stood near the massive kitchen island, a bottle of wine in his hand. I nodded, stepping further inside, feeling small and out of place in his world. This is impressive, I admitted reluctantly. He smiled, pouring 2 glasses of wine. It's home, he said simply, handing me a glass. I took it, unsure of what to say. His presence was overwhelming, and the opulence around me only made it worse. I'm glad you came, he continued, his tone softer now. I didn't have much of a choice, I replied, but the edge in my voice was gone. It wasn't anger anymore, it was resignation. Caleb chuckled, leaning against the counter. You always have a choice, Savannah. You just don't want to admit it. His words struck a nerve, leaving me momentarily speechless. He was too perceptive, too attuned to every crack in my armor. He led me to the dining table near the window, where a beautifully set dinner waited. The view of the city lights made everything feel surreal, like I was in someone else's life. We ate in near silence at first, the only sound the occasional clink of silverware. But Caleb didn't seem uncomfortable. He watched me with a calm intensity that made my skin tingle. You're not as afraid of me as you used to be, he said suddenly, breaking the silence. I paused, unsure of how to respond. I still don't trust you, I said finally. He smiled, taking a sip of his wine. Trust isn't built overnight. But it's a start that you're here. Why do you care so much? I asked, my voice quieter now. Caleb set down his glass and leaned forward slightly. Because I see something in you, Savannah. Something you're too scared to see in yourself. His words sent a shiver down my spine. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but the conviction in his voice made it impossible. As the evening went on, the tension between us grew heavier. Caleb didn't push, but his presence alone was enough to keep me on edge. Every glance, every movement felt deliberate, calculated. When we moved to the living room, he sat beside me on the plush leather couch, closer than I expected. Do you hate me? He asked suddenly, his voice quiet but firm. The question caught me off guard. I looked at him, searching for any hint of mockery, but his expression was unreadable. I don't know, I admitted after a long pause. He nodded, as if he'd expected that answer. Good. Because hate and desire, they're not so different. His words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. I opened my mouth to protest, but the words wouldn't come. Because deep down, I knew there was truth in what he said. At some point, he reached for my hand, his fingers brushing against mine. I froze, but I didn't pull away. Why don't you stop fighting it? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Because it's wrong, I said, but even to my own ears, the words sounded hollow. Wrong, he repeated, his eyes never leaving mine. Or just different. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The air between us was electric, charged with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. His hand moved to my cheek, his touch gentle but firm, and for the first time, I didn't resist. In that moment, I realized something that terrified me. I wanted him. Not just the idea of him, but Caleb himself. Later, as the night deepened, Caleb walked me to the elevator. The city stretched out behind him, a glittering reminder of the world I'd been thrust into. Think about tonight, he said as the elevator doors opened. And about what you really want. I stepped inside, my heart pounding as the doors closed. On the ride down, my reflection in the mirrored walls stared back at me, a mixture of fear, confusion, and something else I didn't want to name. By the time I reached the street, I knew there was no turning back. Whatever was happening between us, it was already too late to stop it. That evening, everything changed. The tension that had been building for days, pulling us closer and closer like a magnet, finally snapped. We were sitting in his penthouse, the city lights twinkling outside like distant stars, but all I could focus on was him. Caleb. Savannah, he said, his voice low and deliberate, as he leaned in just close enough for his breath to brush against my skin. We can't keep pretending this isn't happening. I froze. My heart was pounding so hard I thought he might hear it. Every part of me wanted to run, to stop this before it went any further. But I didn't. Because this time, I didn't want to. You feel it too, he continued, his hand reaching out to gently touch my face. His thumb brushed against my cheek, his touch warm and steady. Stop fighting it. I should have said something, anything, to stop him. But the words wouldn't come. All I could do was look into his eyes, those dark, commanding eyes that seemed to see straight through me. And in that moment, all the fear, all the doubt, it melted away. I leaned into his touch, my breath hitching as his fingers moved to my chin, tilting my face up to meet his. Tell me to stop, he whispered. And I will. But I didn't. Instead, I closed the distance between us. It was as if time stopped. Every moment stretched into eternity, every touch, every whispered word etched into my memory. The world outside ceased to exist. There was no city, no skyline, no Harry. Just him and me. It wasn't rushed or frantic. It was deliberate, almost calculated, as if he was claiming what he had always known would be his. And I let him. I wanted him. When it was over, we sat in silence, the air between us heavy with unspoken truths. Caleb's arm rested on the back of the couch, his fingers grazing my shoulder as he watched me with that same unreadable expression. "You're mine now," he said softly, but there was no mistaking the authority in his voice. It wasn't a question. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The silence was broken by the sharp buzz of my phone. The sound made me jump, the reality of the moment crashing down around me. I reached for the device with trembling hands, my breath catching when I saw the name on the screen, Harry. "Are you going to answer it?" Caleb asked, his tone calm but his eyes sharp. I hesitated. My fingers hovered over the screen, but I couldn't bring myself to press the button. "It doesn't matter," he said after a moment, leaning back into the couch. "You've already made your choice." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. He was right, wasn't he? I had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, made a decision that changed everything. And there was no going back. I silenced the call, my hand falling limp in my lap as the weight of what had just happened settled over me. The next morning, I woke up in his penthouse, the sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Caleb was already awake, standing by the glass wall with a cup of coffee in hand, his silhouette outlined against the bright cityscape. "Good morning," he said without turning around. "Morning," I replied softly, my voice barely audible. He finally turned to face me, his expression calm, almost satisfied. "You don't regret it," he said, and it wasn't a question. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but the truth was written all over my face. I didn't regret it. At least, not in the way I thought I would. But that didn't make it any less terrifying. When I finally made it back to Harry's house, the guilt hit me like a freight train. Harry was waiting for me in the kitchen, his arms crossed over his chest. "How was it?" he asked, his tone casual but his eyes watching me carefully. I hesitated, searching for the right words. "It was fine," I said finally, avoiding his gaze. "Good," he said, nodding. "Caleb's a good man. He'll take care of you." His words made my stomach churn. How could he say that, knowing what had happened? Did he even care? Or was I just a pawn in his game? I excused myself quickly, retreating to my room where I could finally let the emotions overwhelm me. I felt shame, anger, confusion, but also something else. Something I couldn't bring myself to admit. I wanted to see Caleb again. Over the next few days, Caleb's presence became a constant in my life. He called, he messaged, he made sure I knew that I was his. And each time, I found it harder to resist him. "Stop fighting me, Savannah," he said during one of our late-night conversations. "You know this is where you're supposed to be." And maybe he was right. Maybe I did know. But then, everything unraveled. One evening, Caleb showed up unannounced at Harry's house. He walked in with the same confidence he always had, but this time, something was different. His expression was colder, his tone sharper. "We need to talk," he said, motioning for me to follow him outside. I hesitated, glancing at Harry, who simply waved me off. Outside, Caleb's demeanor shifted. He wasn't the calm, composed man I had come to know. He was angry. "Harry knows more than he's letting on," he said, his voice low but full of tension. "He's playing a game, Savannah. And you're the one caught in the middle." My heart sank. "What are you talking about?" "Think about it," he said, stepping closer. "Why would he give you to me so easily? What does he get out of this?" The realization hit me like a thunderbolt. Harry hadn't just handed me over to Caleb out of desperation. He had planned this. He was using me to secure his place in Caleb's world. "I don't belong to him," I said, my voice trembling. "No," Caleb said, his eyes locking onto mine. "You belong to me."